On the evening of August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted the most popular show on American television, a Sunday night Western called Bonanza, to make an announcement that would permanently alter the financial lives of every person on Earth. He used one word that night that has never been honored. That word was temporarily. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That was 54 years ago. The gold window has never reopened. The decision Nixon made that night, following a secret weekend meeting that most Americans have never heard of, did not just change monetary policy. It changed what money is. It changed what your labor is worth. It changed what a house costs, what debt means, and why the price of everything keeps rising while your savings keep shrinking. The paper trail exists. The transcripts survive. The men who were in that room have gone on record. Most people never followed it. If that interests you, subscribe, because this channel covers what most people slept through. To understand what Nixon destroyed on that Sunday night, you have to understand what he destroyed it from. Go back to July 1944. World War II is still being fought. The outcome is not yet certain. But in a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered to do something that had never been done before: design the financial architecture of the post-war world. The Bretton Woods Agreement took 3 weeks to negotiate. The central decision it produced was this: the US dollar would become the world's reserve currency, and it would be backed by gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency would then be pegged to the dollar. The logic was straightforward. By 1944, the United States held approximately 2/3 of the world's entire gold reserves, around $26 billion worth. No other country came close. The dollar was, in the most literal sense, as good as gold. Foreign governments and central banks could walk up to the United States Treasury and exchange their dollars for physical gold at that fixed price. The arrangement was called the gold window. It was the foundation of the entire global financial order. What this system created was a form of discipline. The US government could not simply print money without limit, because every dollar printed was, in theory, backed by gold sitting in Fort Knox. If the US ran persistent trade deficits, foreign nations would accumulate dollars, exchange them for gold, and the reserves would shrink. That shrinkage was a signal, a built-in alarm, that the country was spending beyond its means. For roughly 15 years, the system worked. The United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed economic superpower. Its manufacturing sector produced nearly half of the world's industrial output. The dollar was trusted. American goods were purchased globally. The gold window stayed open because the system was in balance. Then came the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson's administration attempted to fund 2 enormous programs simultaneously: the Great Society welfare expansion at home and the Vietnam War abroad. Economists at the time called this guns and butter. The cost was staggering. Between 1965 and 1970, U.S. federal spending climbed from $118 billion to $196 billion. The government printed dollars to cover the gap. The gold reserves began to drain. European nations, France in particular, under President Charles de Gaulle, watched the dollar supply swell and drew the obvious conclusion. De Gaulle publicly called for a return to the gold standard in 1965, describing the dollar's privileged status as an exorbitant privilege. His finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, coined that phrase. France began systematically converting its dollar holdings into gold, and it was not alone. By 1971, the United States gold reserves had fallen from $26 billion to approximately $10 billion. The problem was the arithmetic. Foreign governments and central banks were holding an estimated $80 billion in dollar-denominated claims, paper that could, under the rules of Bretton Woods, be exchanged for gold at $35 an ounce. The U.S. had $10 billion of gold to back $80 billion of claims. The math had broken. Everyone in the room that weekend knew it. On Friday, August 13th, 1971, 15 men were quietly flown to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. The secrecy was deliberate. No announcement. No press briefing. The State Department was not informed. Allied governments were not consulted. International institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the organization specifically, created at Bretton Woods to manage exactly this kind of crisis, received no warning. The 15 men who gathered that weekend included Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, Paul Volcker, then Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs, George Shultz, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Herbert Stein, Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, and several of Nixon's senior economic and political staff. The immediate trigger for the meeting was specific. In the days prior, the British government had formally requested that the United States convert $3 billion worth of pound sterling reserves into gold. $3 billion against gold reserves of 10. The request made the exposure visible in a way that could no longer be managed quietly. Around the same time, the Swiss franc was being revalued. Speculative pressure on the dollar was intensifying across European currency markets. The weekend meeting was not a debate about whether to act. It was a planning session for what to announce and how to sell it. Paul Volcker, who would later become one of the most consequential Federal Reserve chairmen in history, reflected on that weekend in his memoir. His recorded assessment was blunt. "I was not at all sure it was the right thing to do," he wrote. The decision to close the gold window, he acknowledged, was made not as a principled reform of the monetary system, but as a response to immediate pressure, a crisis measure dressed up as bold leadership. John Connally, the Texas politician who served as Treasury Secretary, was the most forceful voice in the room. His position, according to participants' later accounts, was direct. Move first, control the narrative, don't give the markets or foreign governments time to respond. Connally reportedly framed the three decisions being considered: closing the gold window, imposing a 90-day wage and price freeze, and adding a 10% surcharge on imports, as a package designed to reset American economic power on its own terms. By Sunday morning, the decisions were made. Nixon would go on television that night. The speech was drafted. The word chosen to describe the suspension of gold convertibility was temporary. The word was not an accident. It was chosen specifically to avoid triggering the legal and diplomatic consequences of a formal permanent withdrawal from the Bretton Woods system. A temporary suspension sounded manageable, reversible, surgical. It was none of those things. At 9 o'clock on Sunday evening, August 15, 1971, Richard Nixon addressed the nation. The broadcast preempted Bonanza on NBC. An estimated 80 million Americans were watching. Nixon's framing was deliberate and carefully constructed. He did not present the closing of the gold window as a retreat. He presented it as an assertion of American strength. "The time has come for a new economic policy for the United States," Nixon said. "Its targets are unemployment, inflation, and international speculation." That word, speculation, did significant work in the speech. Nixon positioned the decision not as a response to America's own fiscal overreach, but as a defensive action against foreign currency speculators attacking the dollar. The enemy was external. The decision was protective. The American worker, the American farmer, the American businessman, Nixon named all three groups as the people he was defending. The actual text of the gold suspension was buried in the middle of the address, surrounded by more voter-friendly announcements. The 90-day wage and price freeze, presented first, was the kind of action voters could immediately understand. It meant prices would stop rising, at least temporarily. The import surcharge meant foreign goods would cost more, which sounded like protection for domestic industry. By the time Nixon reached the gold window, The speech had already established a tone of reassurance. I have directed Secretary Connolly to suspend, temporarily, the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. Temporarily. The financial press, for the most part, did not challenge the framing. The following morning, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 33 points. At that time, the largest single-day point gain in its history. Time magazine described Nixon's action as bold and courageous. The New York Times ran a largely positive analysis. The public response, measured in polls conducted in the days following the announcement, was supportive. Allied governments reacted differently. In Japan, the announcement became known simply as the Nixon Shock, a phrase that entered the language immediately, because that is precisely what it was. The Japanese yen had been pegged to the dollar at 360 yen since 1949. Overnight, the entire framework of Japanese monetary planning was invalidated. German, French, and British officials expressed anger at the lack of consultation. The IMF, whose core mandate was to manage exactly these kinds of international monetary adjustments, had been cut out entirely. Arthur Burns, Nixon's Federal Reserve chairman, had privately expressed reservations about the gold suspension during the Camp David weekend. His diary entries from that period, later published, document his discomfort. "I am afraid that we may be making a serious mistake," he wrote in notes from the period. Those reservations did not make it into the public record at the time. What the public was told was a story about defending America from speculators. What the documents show is a story about a government that had spent beyond its means for a decade, had watched its gold drain away, and rather than adjust, chose to change the rules. The consequences of August 15, 1971, did not arrive all at once. They accumulated. In December 1971, the major powers attempted to save what remained of the Bretton Woods framework through the Smithsonian Agreement, a renegotiation of currency exchange rates that was supposed to stabilize the system without gold. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. By March 1973, it had collapsed. The world's major currencies began floating freely against each other, with no fixed anchor of any kind. The gold standard, the mechanism that had constrained government borrowing for most of modern economic history, was gone. What followed almost immediately was the 1973 oil embargo, when OPEC nations, led by Saudi Arabia, cut off oil supplies to the United States in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices quadrupled in a matter of months. The crisis was severe, but it produced a solution that would define the next half-century of global finance. Between 1973 and 1974, the Nixon administration, with Henry Kissinger as the central architect, negotiated a secret arrangement with Saudi Arabia. The terms, later partially declassified, Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection and guarantee Saudi security. Surplus oil revenues, petrodollars, would be recycled back into U.S. Treasury bonds and American weapons purchases. The dollar had lost its gold backing. It now had oil backing instead. Every nation that needed to buy oil needed dollars to do it. Global demand for the dollar was maintained, but now by geopolitical arrangement rather than a fixed commodity peg. The immediate economic consequences of the gold window's closure were severe. U.S. inflation, which stood at 4.4% in 1971, climbed to 11% by 1974 and reached 13.3% by 1979, the decade between Nixon's announcement and Paul Volcker's brutal interest rate increases of 1980, when the Federal Reserve raised rates to 20% to kill inflation, is documented as one of the most economically destructive periods in modern American history. Unemployment and inflation rose simultaneously, a combination economists called stagflation, which was not supposed to be possible under prevailing theory. The wage data from this period is precise and documented. In 1971, American worker productivity and real wages had been rising together for roughly 2 decades. The two lines tracked each other closely. After 1971, the lines diverged. Productivity continued rising. Real wages, wages adjusted for the actual cost of living, stagnated and then fell behind. The gap between what American workers produced and what they were paid widened every year from that point forward. The federal debt figures are on the public record. In 1971, total U.S. federal debt stood at approximately $398 billion. By 1980, it had reached $908 billion. By 1990, $3.2 trillion. By 2008, $10 trillion. By 2024, it had crossed $34 trillion. With no gold constraint, there was no hard limit. The median American home price in 1971 was approximately $25,000. Adjusted for inflation using the official CPI, that should equate to roughly $190,000 today. The actual median home price in 2024 exceeded $420,000, more than double the inflation-adjusted figure. Housing did not just keep pace with a debased currency. It accelerated beyond it, driven by decades of cheap credit made possible by a system with no anchor. This is where the story stops being history. Every dollar you hold right now is backed by nothing except the declared confidence of the United States government. Not gold, not silver, not any physical commodity. The Federal Reserve, the institution that issues your currency, can create dollars in whatever quantity it determines necessary. The constraint that existed before August 15, 1971, no longer exists. The consequences of that reality were demonstrated in specific documented events. In 2008, when the U.S. financial system collapsed under the weight of mortgage-backed securities and leveraged debt, the Federal Reserve created approximately $4 trillion in new money through a program called quantitative easing, buying government bonds and other assets with money that had not previously existed. This was presented as an emergency measure. Inflation remained relatively contained through the 2010s because much of that money flowed into asset markets, stocks, real estate, financial instruments, rather than everyday goods. The people who owned those assets saw them rise. The people who did not, did not. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down the global economy, the United States created approximately $5 trillion in fiscal stimulus within 12 months. This time, the money flowed more directly into the economy. The inflation that followed, reaching over 9% in 2022, the highest level in 40 years, was the direct and documented consequence. The purchasing power of the US dollar has fallen by approximately 87% since 1971. A dollar today buys what roughly 13 cents bought in the year Nixon made his announcement. The people most exposed to this erosion are the people who hold the most dollars in savings accounts, working and middle class. Americans whose wealth is denominated in the currency that is losing value every year. The housing affordability crisis that defines the economic experience of Americans under 40 is not a mystery. It is the documented outcome of 5 decades of monetary expansion without constraint. Every round of cheap credit, and there have been many, pushed asset prices higher. Every round of inflation made savings worth less. The compounding effect across 50 years is the world you are living in now. This is the reason your rent is not affordable. This is the reason your savings account cannot keep pace with the cost of living. This is the reason the national debt reaches numbers that no individual can meaningfully comprehend, $34 trillion and climbing, with no mechanism to constrain it short of political will, which has proven insufficient. Nixon said it was temporary. The word was recorded. The speech survives. The promise was made in front of 80 million people, and it has never been kept. Most people slept through this. You didn't. Subscribe because there's more.